Why was she the only one who saw it? The others, men with reputations carved from years in the field, had studied the same satellite feeds, pored over the same maps, and walked through the same mission brief. Yet none of them had noticed the small, silent details that made the valley below feel wrong. A valley that should have been a straightforward extraction zone now looked to her like a hungry mouth, waiting for someone to step too close. Staff Sergeant Nova Ghost Martinez didn't move. She had been still for nearly 6 hours, soaked through by a stubborn mist that clung to her hair and rifle, breathing so shallowly that even the damp leaves beneath her barely shifted. Stillness was her art, and in stillness, the world revealed itself. The ridge she occupied was an island above the chaos, a narrow lip of shale and roots overlooking a sea of green. 3 clicks below, SEAL Team 7 was threading its way toward the valley floor, 8 silhouettes dressed in black kit, each one a shadow among shadows. From this height, they were nothing more than tiny pulses of motion, black specks in a jungle that swallowed noise and light alike. She watched them the way a hunter watches prey, not with malice, but with a quiet, necessary detachment. Her scope swept the undergrowth in slow, patient arcs. Every leaf, every bird call, every shift of wind became part of a language only she seemed to understand. And somewhere beneath that language, a sentence was being written, one that didn't end well. There, a bird call that stopped too abruptly. There, a section of underbrush slightly compressed. There, the faintest imprint of a boot heel, half buried beneath fallen leaves. None of it meant anything on its own, but together they screamed one undeniable truth. The valley was wrong. 7 Actual, this is Ghost, she whispered into her throat mic, her voice steady and low. I've got potential hostiles in placement. Recommend halt and reassess. Static, then Commander Vance's voice, cool, clipped, dismissive. Negative visual, Ghost. We're reading no contacts. Hold position and continue overwatch. The words hit like a cold slap. Of course, he still didn't trust her. He hadn't from the start. She replayed the morning's briefing in her mind. The fluorescent-lit room, the smell of burnt coffee, the casual way Vance had dismissed her without ever looking her in the eye. I want Henderson on overwatch, he'd said. Not the girl. Not the girl. Nova had stood there, motionless, every muscle in her body fighting the urge to react. She'd heard worse before, heard it whispered behind her back in barracks halls and in the locker room after missions. But coming from the man who would be depending on her tonight, the words had cut deeper than usual. She was the best shot in the unit. Everyone knew it. The mission data knew it. That was the only reason her name ended up on the manifest, but none of that mattered to Vance. To him, she was a gamble, a liability, a woman with a rifle. And now, as the SEALs advanced into a place she was almost certain was a kill zone, he was proving that point again, refusing to believe what he couldn't see himself. 7 Actual, she said again, firmer this time. Recommend immediate stop. I'm reading multiple points of disturbance, classic ambush geometry. Left flank 200 meters, right flank 210. Recommend fallback. Silence, then a sigh. Ghost, we've got no eyes on anything, keep scanning. It was the kind of stubbornness that got people killed. She clenched her jaw, trying to steady her breathing. It wasn't pride. It wasn't about being right. It was about the sick, coiling feeling in her gut, the one that had saved lives before. She'd learned to trust it more than any intel feed. And then the forest confirmed her worst fear. A bird froze mid-flight. The wind held its breath, and one of the SEALs, the point man, stepped forward into a patch of earth that looked too clean, too untouched. 7 Actual, stop. Move back 3 me. The rest of her warning was swallowed by a roar. A column of soil erupted into the air, hurling the point man skyward like a rag doll before gravity yanked him back down. The explosion rolled through the valley in a brutal wave. Then came the gunfire. Dozens of muzzles flared in the tree line, bright orange tongues licking at the darkness. Bullets shredded branches, chewed through bark, screamed against rock. Men shouted, some in command, others in agony. The radio filled with chaos, clipped syllables, frantic calls for cover, the unmistakable edge of panic. Contact, contact, multiple KIA. Man down, I need a medic. God, they're everywhere. For a fraction of a second, Nova froze, not in fear but in something heavier. Guilt. She had seen it coming. She had tried to stop it. And now 8 men were pinned in a valley that had just turned into a slaughterhouse. She exhaled slowly. There was no time for guilt. Orders, she reminded herself, were paper. People were not. 7 actual, she said, voice turning to steel. This is Ghost. I am engaging. Negative, Ghost, Vance barked. You'll be dead in 10 if you don't move. You'll all be dead in 5 if I don't, she replied, not as a threat but as a fact. Then she squeezed the trigger. The suppressed shot was little more than a whisper, but in that whisper the balance shifted. Through her scope, she watched a man with an RPG stiffen, stumble, and fall. Then another, and another. The ring of fire closing around the seals wavered. Ghost had entered the fight. The next 10 seconds were chaos. The 10 after that were something else, a rhythm, her rhythm. Breathe. Settle. Adjust for wind. Lead the target. Squeeze. Each shot was a conversation between breath and motion, between wind and gravity. A man breaking from cover, down. Another trying to flank left, down. A machine gunner setting up behind a tree, down. The radio crackled with disbelief. Ghost, what the hell? RPG team left side neutralized, she answered calmly. Machine gunner at 412 down. Recommend movement on my mark. Her voice, cold and precise, cut through the panic. Slowly, the SEALs began to move, dragging the wounded, shifting position, laying down suppressive fire where they could. She directed them with clinical efficiency, covering their every step with a symphony of shots. 5-man suppression left, 2 carry, 3, 2, 1 move. Every time an enemy rose to fire, she found the seam in his motion and fed him a silent death. Every time they tried to flank, she carved their maneuver apart with 2 well-placed rounds. Confusion spread through the enemy ranks like a contagion. They fired blindly into the tree line, trying to find the ghost that was dismantling their ambush shot by shot. But a suppressed M110 doesn't play by their rules. There was no muzzle flash, no signature, only bodies dropping and panic blooming. At the 20-minute mark, the fight became something else entirely, a battle of will. She shifted positions twice, crawling through mud and roots to maintain her angles. Each move was a gamble, but staying still was worse. Movement kept her invisible. Mobility kept them guessing. And still the numbers were against her. 24 active hostiles, another dozen in reserve, wounded men screaming below, QRF 45 minutes out, air support grounded by weather. Logic said it was hopeless, but logic had never stared through her scope before. 2 fighters broke from the tree line, sprinting toward her position. She lined up the shot, threading it through a 7-inch gap between leaves. The first man dropped. The second dove behind a log. Nova adjusted, breathed, and sent a round through the side of his neck. She reported calmly, enemy attempt on overwatch neutralized. Continue movement west. Ghost, someone panted over comms, half laughing through the chaos. You are a ghoul. Keep this up and I'll buy you a beer in Norfolk. Save the beer, she replied. Just get your boys home. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. Ammo ran low. Smoke grenades bloomed across the valley, blinding her lines of sight. RPG fire slammed into the ridge, splintering bark and throwing shrapnel into the air. She repositioned again, heart hammering but hands steady, and reopened her field of fire. The enemy was adapting, but so was she. They had numbers, she had patience. They had fury, she had precision. And beneath it all, a thought pulsed, steady and stubborn. You said I wasn't ready. You said I couldn't handle pressure. You were wrong. Somewhere below, Vance's voice broke through the static, hoarse and trembling. QRF 12 minutes out. Air still grounded. 12 minutes. That was all she needed to buy them now. 12 more minutes of precision, of discipline, of refusing to break. She shifted one last time, her knees sinking into damp soil, her rifle cradled like a promise. The rain was lighter now, a thin mist clinging to the valley. And still she breathed, slow and deliberate, eyes locked through glass on a world that seemed to have narrowed to crosshairs and heartbeat. This was where she belonged. Not in the briefing room where they doubted her. Not behind a desk where paperwork decided worth. Here in the mud, the mist, the silence between shots, she was undeniable. And the men below, bleeding and battered but alive, were starting to believe it too. The ridge had been a place of patience. Now it was a place of reckoning. And with every soft report of her rifle, Nova Martinez rewrote the story they'd told about her, one shot at a time. How many seconds can a man bleed before the body quits? Nova had asked herself that question 100 times in training, but now it was no longer theory. Below her, a SEAL with half his leg torn open was screaming through clenched teeth, two teammates dragging him through churned mud. Blood painted the valley floor, bright against the dark rain-soaked earth. She could see it even through her scope. The medic was shouting something she couldn't hear. She didn't need to. She knew the look, that frantic mix of calculation and panic. Every second mattered, and every second someone tried to take it from them. Her scope flicked right. Two fighters sprinted from the tree line with rifles raised, their path converging on the wounded. Nova's breath settled. One squeeze, one drop. The first fighter crumpled mid-stride, legs folding beneath him. A heartbeat later she adjusted, a shift, a breath, another squeeze, and the second man collapsed into the mud just shy of the wounded SEALs. "Ghost," Vance's voice cracked through the comms, edged with disbelief and relief in equal measure. "You just saved my medic." Nova didn't answer. Words wasted seconds. Her reply came in the form of another shot, then another. The valley was chaos, but inside the chaos she had found rhythm. 15 seconds to scan, 5 to fire, 2 to correct, breathe, reset, again, the math of survival. Her rifle's suppressor coughed into the mist, almost gentle against the storm of enemy fire. Men screamed. Orders barked in foreign tongues. A machine gun spat from the eastern ridge, forcing the SEALs to flatten against the mud. Nova shifted. Angle correction, 400 meters, wind 3 miles per hour east. Exhale, squeeze. The machine gun fell silent. The SEALs moved again, carrying their wounded like broken cargo, slipping between shattered stumps. Nova orchestrated their path with quiet precision. She wasn't just shooting, she was conducting. Each shot a note, each pause a rest, the whole firefight a grim symphony written in lead. But beneath the rhythm her chest burned, not from exhaustion, from restraint. She remembered Vance's words in the briefing, "Not the girl." She wanted to scream, wanted to shout through the radio that this moment, these lives saved, this extraction carved out of death itself was proof. But that wasn't who she was. Vindication wasn't spoken. It was lived. And so she breathed, adjusted, and fired again. The enemy adapted. Smoke canisters hissed, billowing thick white veils that blurred her scope. Figures flickered in and out of sight, shadows half-formed. She tracked them by instinct, by the way smoke curled differently around bodies in motion. A muzzle flash sparked. She counted the arc, the angle, 2 shots. One body dropped inside the haze. Another staggered back into the smoke, silent. Her radio buzzed with half-choked laughter. One of the SEALs, Brick, she thought, was shouting over the gunfire, voice ragged but wild. "Ghost, you're unreal. You're not human. You're—" "Move your wounded," she cut in sharply. "Talk later." There was no later if they didn't move now. 30 minutes into the ambush, her bandolier was lighter. The enemy was thinning but not broken. Every shot carried more weight, each cartridge a choice. She rationed her fire with ruthless discipline. Don't waste. Don't rush. The wrong shot could cost a life below. A rustle, her peripheral caught at two figures scaling her ridge. Close, too close. She pivoted, rifle snapping left, breath shallow. The first figure rose over the rocks. She didn't hesitate. One round, head snapped back. He tumbled down. The second froze, wide-eyed, spotting the phantom that had haunted his men. He fumbled his rifle up. Nova was faster. A suppressed cough. He dropped into silence. Her hands trembled once, not from fear, but from the closeness of it. She swallowed the tremor and slid lower into cover. Overwatch wasn't supposed to be a knife fight, but war never asked permission before changing the rules. 7 actual, she said quietly. 2 hostiles attempted Overwatch breach, both neutralized. Continue westward movement. Silence answered, then Vance's voice, softer, almost reverent. Copy, Ghost. It was the first time he'd said her call sign without disdain. She let the moment pass. Pride could wait. Survival could not. Time crawled. 45 minutes became an hour. Rain thickened. Her uniform clung heavy, soaked in sweat and storm. Still she stayed prone, muscles locked, eyes welded to glass. Each minute, another life balanced on her steadiness. At one point, a medic screamed for tourniquets. She caught the sound faintly, carried by wind and radio static. She pictured the wounded man's face, pale, lips trembling, clinging to seconds she was buying with each shot. And for the first time that night she faltered, just slightly, just enough to feel the weight of it. She wasn't shooting targets. She was carving time into existence. Every squeeze of her trigger was another heartbeat given to someone else, another breath, another chance to go home. Her throat tightened, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Ghost, Vance came again, ragged. QRF 12 minutes out, air still grounded, hold. 12 minutes, 12 more lifetimes in this valley. Nova slid to her third position, belly low, rifle balanced on a knot of roots slick with rain. She angled east, covering the final gap the SEALs would need to cross. Smoke thinned. Figures emerged, tired, frantic, desperate. The last surge of enemy resistance. She picked them apart, one by one, calm, surgical, unrelenting. Each man who rose to fire fell before he pulled the trigger. Each who tried to rally his squad collapsed mid-sentence. A commander shouted orders. Her bullet cut his voice into silence. She counted 11, 12, 13. The ledger grew heavy. Numbers that meant survival for the men below, but finality for the ones who'd never rise again. By the time rotor blades began to thunder in the distance, she'd reached 15. And still she did not celebrate. Because in her chest the truth gnawed. She had saved lives, yes, but she had taken just as many. Each shot a salvation, each shot a theft. The helicopters roared into view, cutting rain into mist. Blackhawks descended, skids punching into the mud, rotors screaming above the chaos. Medics sprinted. The SEALs scrambled, dragging their wounded into the belly of the birds. Only then, only when the valley filled with the sound of salvation, did Nova lower her rifle. Her body shook with adrenaline, every muscle humming. She let the M110 hang loose against her chest, heavy as a cross. Ghost, Vance's voice cracked, softer than she'd ever heard. Get to the LZ, we'll debrief on the bird. He didn't say the words she remembered from the briefing. Not the girl. He didn't need to. The apology was in the break of his voice, the catch of breath between syllables. Nova rose slowly from her hide, legs stiff, uniform soaked, fingers trembling. She ghosted down the ridge, each step carrying her away from the battlefield and toward the waiting roar of Blackhawks. Behind her, the valley fell silent, broken now only by the uneasy hush of trees that had witnessed too much. She didn't look back, not yet. The fight was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. How do you measure silence after a night like that? For Nova, it wasn't the absence of gunfire that struck her as the Blackhawk lifted off. It was the weight of the breathing. 8 men, battered and bloodied, each drawing in air they might never have tasted if she hadn't been on that ridge. The thrum of rotors filled the fuselage, steady and relentless, but beneath it pulsed the softer sounds. The medic's muttered vitals check, the groan of a man slipping in and out of consciousness, the quiet, broken thank yous whispered into headsets. Nova sat rigid on the steel bench, her rifle between her boots, hands folded in a way that looked calm but wasn't. Her knuckles were white. Her heartbeat refused to slow. Across from her, Vance stared at the deck, helmet in his lap, eyes fixed on nothing. He looked smaller now, not weaker, just human. The kind of human who had brushed too close to death and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He hadn't spoken since they'd boarded. None of them had. It wasn't that they didn't have words. It was that none felt enough. Nova glanced toward one of the wounded, the point man who had triggered the IED. His leg was gone below the knee, the stump wrapped tight in bandages already soaked through with crimson. The medic was pressing hard, whispering that they were almost there, that he'd be fine, that he just needed to hold on. Nova looked away. The guilt was sharp and cold, carving through the thin armor of her composure. I saw it, I told them, and still he stepped forward. The thoughts circled in her head over and over. It wasn't fair, she knew that. It wasn't her fault. But guilt doesn't care about fairness. It crawls in, makes a home, and refuses to leave. Hey. The voice was low, roughened by exhaustion. Vance was looking at her now, really looking. For the first time since this mission began, there was no disdain in his eyes, no doubt, just something that hovered between gratitude and regret. "You saved us," he said. The words were almost a whisper, but they landed heavy. "All of us." Nova's mouth opened, but no words came. She didn't know how to respond. A simple thank you felt inadequate. A just doing my job felt dishonest. So she just nodded. The helicopter bucked slightly as it broke through a patch of turbulence. Rain lashed the fuselage windows. Somewhere below them, the valley shrank into a dark smear on the earth, a graveyard for men who had thought themselves hunters. And for Nova, it was now something else entirely. A scar. A place she would remember not for the 15 shots she'd fired, but for the seconds she hadn't been fast enough to prevent. The base came into view, floodlights cutting through the mist, the perimeter fence a jagged shadow against the night. The Black Hawk banked hard, descended, and slammed into the landing zone with a wet, heavy thud. Medics were waiting. Stretchers rushed forward. Hands pulled the wounded from the bird and vanished into the chaos of the field hospital. Nova stepped down last, boots sinking into the mud, rifle still cradled against her chest like a heartbeat she hadn't quite let go of. She expected to feel relief. She didn't. What she felt was something quieter, an ache beneath her ribs, a weight pressing down behind her sternum. It wasn't sorrow exactly. It was more complicated than that, something that lived in the space between pride and regret. The debrief trailer was bright and sterile, smelling of coffee, antiseptic, and sweat. The operations officer was already there, laptop open, feeds streaming from drones and helmet cams. A map of the valley sprawled across the table, dotted with red and blue markers, enemies neutralized, friendlies evacuated. Vance entered first, shoulders slumped, helmet tucked under one arm. Nova followed, her presence drawing every pair of eyes in the room. Some stared with awe, others with disbelief, a few with something that might have been shame. 15 confirmed enemy KIA, the ops officer said without preamble. 0 friendly KIA, 3 serious wounded, 5 minor. Extraction successful. There was a murmur around the table. The numbers spoke for themselves. They didn't tell the whole story, they never did, but they were enough to shift something in the air. The ops officer turned to Nova. "Ghost, how did you see it before anyone else?" She met his gaze evenly. "I read the forest," she said. "Bird calls stopped. Underbrush was compressed. The placement was too deliberate. Classic ambush geometry. If you learn to see what isn't there, you see the seams." A long silence followed. Men who had dismissed her that morning now leaned in, hungry for details. Questions came technical, precise, respectful. They wanted to understand what she had done, how she had done it. And then Vance spoke. "I was wrong." The room went still. He stood there, mud still streaked across his uniform, blood dried into the creases of his gloves, and looked directly at her. "I was wrong," he said again, louder this time. "I asked that you not be assigned. I didn't trust you, and there's no excuse for that. You saved my team. You saved my life." He took a slow breath, as if forcing the next words out. "I've already submitted paperwork recommending you for a Silver Star." The room shifted. Someone murmured in approval. Someone else clapped once, softly. Nova stared at the table. Awards meant little to her, pieces of metal pinned to fabric. But they meant something to the system. They turned performance into proof. They made sure the next woman wouldn't have to fight the same battle to be believed. The hours blurred after that, after-action reports, sensor logs, questions from analysts, a parade of officers who suddenly wanted to shake her hand. The regional commander himself appeared, stern and immovable, followed by a two-star general who removed his cap before addressing her. "I've read the report," the general said. "I want to know how the community wasted talent like yours for this long." Nova told him, applications denied, courses deferred, reassignment paperwork mysteriously delayed, each instance a paper cut, together a wound. The general's jaw tightened. "That ends today. I'm ordering you into the advanced sniper course as soon as the schedule allows. And once you complete it, I want you considered for an instructor billet. Teach what you did out there." For the first time since she'd left the ridge, Nova felt something warm spark beneath her ribs. It wasn't joy. It wasn't pride. It was possibility. She had spent years proving herself, over and over. And now, finally, someone wasn't asking her to prove, they were asking her to teach. The base hummed with whispers in the days that followed. "Ghost," they called her now. The nickname spread from team to team, briefing to briefing. It clung to her like mist. One night Brick found her alone outside the mess hall. He pressed a small leather patch into her hand, a steel trident stitched into the center. On the back, someone had embroidered 4 words, Team 7 Guardian. "You earned this," he said. "You don't have to be one of us by blood to wear our colors by heart." Nova stared at the patch for a long time before tucking it into her pocket. Later in the mess hall, the team gathered around a table scarred by years of missions and memories. The wounded were there too, pale but alive. The jokes were clumsy, the laughter too loud, the relief too raw. Vance lifted his cup. "We learned something," he said. "We were small-minded, that's on me. But we also learned that there's strength in changing your mind." He looked at Nova, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "If you'll have us, Ghost, we want you with Team 7, permanently. Not because I was wrong once, but because I don't want to be wrong twice." She didn't need time to think. She nodded. Acceptance felt like a small animal settling deep inside her chest, something restless finally at peace. It wasn't the medal, it wasn't the praise. It was the chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with the men she'd saved, to watch over them again, and again, and again. And as the night wore on, laughter echoing through the mess hall, Nova felt the faintest smile tug at the corners of her mouth. The mission was over, but the story of Ghost was just beginning. What do you teach them, the ones who have never heard the forest breathe? That question lingered in Nova's mind as she stood at the front of the cold classroom weeks later, staring at 24 young faces, most of them men, a handful of women, all of them wearing the same mix of eagerness and skepticism she'd once worn herself. Maps lined the walls. A projector hummed softly behind her, frozen on a still frame of the valley where she'd saved SEAL Team 7. They'd all read the report by now. They'd seen the sensor data, the timestamps, the kill counts. To them, she was a legend. To herself, she was still the same woman who had knelt in the mud with a rifle and too many lives depending on her steadiness. "Everyone wants to know how I hit 15 shots in under 2 hours," she began, her voice quiet but commanding. "They want to know about the math, the wind, the angles, but none of that matters if you don't know how to see." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Seeing," she continued, "isn't just spotting what's there. It's spotting what is." A few brows furrowed. She expected that. Most of them had been taught to look for shapes, patterns, silhouettes. Few had been taught to look for the spaces between them. "Bird calls," she said, clicking to the next slide, a still image of the ridge line from her overwatch position. "Compression in the underbrush, tracks that don't match, wind that dies suddenly. These are not random. They're language. Learn the language and the forest talks." One trainee raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you know when it's telling the truth?" Nova's lips twitched into a rare half-smile. "You don't, not at first, but you listen anyway, and eventually you start to hear the difference between a whisper and a lie." For the next hour she walked them through every detail of that night, how she had read the terrain, how she'd chosen her positions, why she'd shifted when she did. She showed them her shot log, the real-time decision-making behind each engagement. And she told them with deliberate bluntness about the shots she didn't take. "Sometimes the best shot is the one you hold," she said. "A rushed shot doesn't just miss, it costs time, and time costs lives." The youngest trainee, a lanky kid barely out of basic, with too much confidence in his eyes, raised a hand. "You make it sound easy." Nova looked at him for a long moment. "Good," she said finally, "because if it looks easy here, you might stand a chance out there." The class laughed softly, but the kid's smile faltered. She could see the realization settle in that none of this was a game, that behind every technique she taught was a body in the mud, a heartbeat she'd fought to keep beating. After class, she stayed behind, running her fingers lightly over the edge of the map. It was strange being here instead of out there. The silence of the classroom was different from the silence of a ridge. It didn't hum with danger. It didn't throb with life-and-death urgency. But in some ways, it felt heavier. Because here she wasn't just shooting for survival. She was shaping it. 2 months later, she was back with Team 7. Different mission, different terrain, same weight. This time, there was no hesitation in Vance's voice when he briefed the team. "Martinez on Overwatch," he said simply, like it was the most natural choice in the world. No one argued. The op was a joint task with a local strike unit, a high-value target moving through a stretch of dense jungle near the border. Intel was shaky. The weather was worse. The plan was to intercept before the convoy reached a fortified village. They'd inserted under moonlight, silent and surgical. Nova had moved ahead, slipping into position 2 hours before dawn, her rifle cradled in the crook of her arm like an old friend. And as the first hints of morning light crept through the canopy, she saw it movement. Not the convoy, something else. 7 actual ghost, she whispered. "I've got 2 ahead of the convoy route, unmarked uniforms moving like scouts." "Copy," Vance replied. "Do not engage unless hostile." She watched. The pair moved carefully, methodically, scanning the path ahead. They weren't just scouts. They were setting positions, ambush geometry again. Her jaw tightened. 7 actual, recommend halt. This isn't clean." A pause, then copy, ghost holding. The convoy's advance slowed. The strike team adjusted formation. And because they did, they caught the ambushers before they were ready. 3 fighters dragged from cover, blindfolded and alive, before the first shot was ever fired. "Nice call," Vance said over comms. Nova didn't answer. The victory was quiet, invisible, the kind she preferred. The op unfolded smoothly after that, or as smoothly as anything ever did in their world. The convoy rolled into the kill zone and never knew it. The strike team hit with speed and precision. Nova covered the exfil from a high ridge, her shots few and deliberate. each one a nail sealing the coffin of resistance. By the time they returned to base, the target was in custody, and no one on their side had so much as a scratch. Brick clapped her on the back as they walked off the transport. "I'm starting to think you've got a sixth sense for this stuff." She shrugged, just listening to the forest. But it wasn't the forest she was listening to anymore. It was the team. The way they moved now, how they trusted her calls without question, how they looked to her not as a contingency but as a cornerstone. Trust had taken root, respect had followed. That night she stood alone on the perimeter wall, the humid air heavy with the smell of rain and diesel. Below her, the base buzzed, laughter spilling from the mess, the clatter of weapons being cleaned, the dull thump of a basketball game played under floodlights. For the first time in a long time, she let herself exhale. The ghosts of the valley still followed her. They always would. But now they whispered something different, not accusation, but purpose. Skill wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving that what she did mattered, that lives could be shaped, saved, even spared entirely if someone was willing to listen to the silence. She thought of her students, learning to see absence, of the young sniper who had once thought it looked easy, of the man in the Black Hawk whose leg she couldn't save. And she realized something that she'd never said out loud. Being good at killing was never the point. Being good at protecting, that was. And as long as she had breath in her lungs and a rifle in her hands, that was exactly what she would do. What makes a person learn to wait? For Nova, the answer lived in memories she rarely spoke aloud long before the uniform, long before the rifle, before anyone called her Ghost. It was in the cold winters of Montana, where the wind howled through pine like a warning and silence was a language all its own. She'd been 12 the first time her father took her into the woods to track elk. He walked ahead, patient and quiet, teaching her that the forest was not conquered, it was listened to. "You don't rush the shot," he'd said, crouching low beside her. "You earn it." At 12, she hadn't fully understood. At 26, on foreign soil with lives on the line, she lived by those words. Now, years later, that lesson felt sharper than ever. Because the mission they were preparing for wasn't just dangerous. It was the kind of mission that left scars, the kind that tested more than skill. It tested who you were beneath the call sign. It started with an encrypted briefing in a windowless room. Maps covered the walls, satellite images, terrain models, intercepted communications. The target, a remote insurgent command cell buried deep in the highlands, beyond reliable drone range and too fortified for a surgical strike. Intelligence believed they were planning coordinated assaults on 3 Allied outposts within the month. "Intel confirms HVT presence," the operations officer said. "We're greenlit. We go in quiet, we come out fast." SEAL Team 7 would lead the assault. Nova would be their eyes again, but this time she'd also carry a secondary task. If the HVT presented himself, the shot would be hers. Her, not Henderson, not Ray's, her. The room felt different now when orders were given. No one second-guessed. No one questioned if she was the girl. Respect had settled into the team's bones, as natural as muscle memory, but with that respect came a heavier weight. They expected her to deliver, and that meant no mistakes. The infill was brutal, a 14-kilometer trek through jungle so thick it swallowed the moonlight. The rain never stopped, a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked every stitch of gear. Vance led the team with his usual calm precision. Brick cracked dark jokes into the silence, and Nova ghosted along the flank, scanning every shadow for movement. By the time they reached the Overwatch Ridge, dawn was bleeding into the horizon, thin streaks of gray slicing through a sky swollen with storm clouds. Nova crawled into position, set her bipod, and scanned the compound below. It was a walled structure half swallowed by jungle, ringed with sentries and crude watchtowers. Trucks idled near the gate. Radio antennas clawed at the sky. And inside, if intel was right, The man orchestrating a wave of attacks sipped his morning tea with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. 7 Actual, this is Ghost, she whispered into the mic. Eyes on target site. Approximately 30 hostiles visible, possible more inside. Perimeter rotations consistent, no sign of alert. Copy Ghost, Vance replied. Stand by for breach plan. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The waiting was always the hardest part, the space between readiness and action, where doubt had the room to grow. It crept in now, subtle but insistent. What if she missed the shot? What if the target slipped away? What if, after everything she'd done, they were right about her all along? She pushed the thoughts away. They were noise, and noise killed. Hours passed before the breach window arrived. The team slipped into position under the cover of rain, silent shadows against the jungle's edge. Nova's scope tracked every movement, the roving sentries, the guard who lingered too long by the south gate, the one who lit a cigarette despite protocol. 7 Actual, Ghost, she said. South Tower guard, 3 o'clock rotation. Recommend takedown before breach. Copy, Vance replied. On your go. She adjusted wind, checked her breathing, and squeezed. The shot was clean and silent. The sentry folded over the railing like a marionette with its strings cut. South Tower neutralized, she reported. Proceed. Team 7 surged forward. Suppressed rifles whispered through the rain. The outer defenses fell before the alarm ever had a chance to sound. Within minutes, they breached the compound, clearing room by room. Then came the call. Ghost, Vance hissed over comms. HVT moving. Second floor, east wing. Window approaching your sightline. Her heartbeat slowed, not sped, as adrenaline bled into focus. Through the scope, she caught a flicker of movement. A man in a tailored jacket, flanked by 2 bodyguards, stepping toward a window. She adjusted elevation, calculated wind, accounted for rain density. Then hesitation. He wasn't armed, at least not visibly, and behind him, through the window's distortion, she saw something she hadn't expected. A woman, maybe a wife, maybe not. A child, no, too, clinging to the woman's legs. Her finger hovered over the trigger. The order was clear. The shot was hers. But this was the part no manual ever prepared you for. The man in her crosshairs wasn't a faceless enemy. He was someone's father, someone's husband, and pulling that trigger meant shattering more than just a chain of command. Ghost, Vance said again, urgency creeping in. Do you have the shot? Her breath caught. Her pulse slowed. She thought of the SEAL on the helicopter, his leg gone. She thought of the faces of her students, bright and eager. She thought of the weight of every decision she'd ever made behind a rifle. And then she thought of the 3 outposts, each one packed with men and women who would die if this man walked free. Yes, she whispered. The trigger broke. The shot cracked through rain and glass. The HVT's body jerked, crumpled, and disappeared from view. Chaos erupted below, shouts, scrambling guards, a flood of motion as Team 7 moved to extract. Target neutralized, Nova said softly. Mission complete. They exfiltrated under a curtain of rain, the jungle swallowing their footprints as helicopters roared low over the canopy. By the time they reached base, the adrenaline had begun to fade, replaced by the familiar, hollow quiet that always followed a clean shot. In the debrief, no one questioned her choice. The op was a success. The insurgent network was in disarray. Attacks were likely averted. Commendations were already being drafted. But alone in her bunk that night, Nova stared at the ceiling and saw not the man's face, but the faces behind him. The woman, the children, the moment of hesitation she'd forced herself to bury. And for the first time in a long time, doubt crept back in. Was it justice or just war? Was it duty or something darker? The questions had no answers, not the kind she could live with anyway. But she knew one thing with clarity: the choice had been hers. and the consequences, all of them, would be hers too. Still, as dawn broke and the base stirred awake, another truth rose with the sun. Somewhere out there, soldiers were alive who might not have been. Futures still existed because she had done what was necessary. And that, more than medals, more than praise, was the reason she'd keep doing it. Because being Ghost wasn't about pulling the trigger. It was about what and who lived when the smoke cleared. What happens when the silence follows you home. For Nova, it started 3 nights after the HVT op, not on a ridge, not in a debriefing room, but in the stillness of her quarters. Sleep had become a cautious visitor since that mission, drifting in for a few hours, then slipping away the moment her mind replayed the image she couldn't forget. A pair of small hands gripping a woman's leg just behind the glass. She told herself the shot had been clean, necessary. That 3 outposts, 300 souls might have survived because she didn't hesitate for too long. But justification and peace were 2 different things, and one didn't guarantee the other. The knock at her door came just past midnight. It wasn't unusual. Soldiers rarely slept well after missions like that. But when she opened it and saw Vance standing there, fatigue etched into every line of his face, she knew this wasn't a standard check-in. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply. "Me neither." He stepped in without waiting for an invitation. They didn't talk at first, just sat, him on the edge of the small metal table, her by the window, watching rain slide down the glass like time refusing to stop. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "Did I?" she asked softly, still looking out. "Or did I just do what the mission asked for?" Vance was silent for a moment. "I've ordered a lot of shots in my career, some I don't think about twice. Others, I still see their faces." Nova turned to look at him. "Do they go away?" He shook his head. "No, but they stop controlling you." The honesty in his voice was raw, stripped of the usual bravado that wrapped men like him. It wasn't the answer she'd wanted, but it was the truth she needed. The next morning brought a different kind of mission. Not combat, not reconnaissance, something more complicated. A liaison from Intelligence Command was visiting the base, a civilian analyst who had been working the insurgent networks for months. She wanted a full debrief from the sniper's perspective. Specifically, the ops officer said, handing Nova a file, they're interested in the decision-making around the engagement. Nova flipped the file open. Photos stared back at her. Surveillance images, the HVT, his wife, his 2 children. Her chest tightened. "They know about the family," she said quietly. "They always know," the officer replied. "It's part of the assessment." The meeting was clinical. Questions about line of sight, decision timing, shot placement. All things Nova could answer with data and diagrams. But then the analyst, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, asked the question she'd been dreading. "Did you hesitate?" Nova didn't lie. "Yes." "How long?" "Less than 2 seconds." The analyst nodded. "And why did you take the shot?" Nova stared at the photograph of the man she'd killed. Because not taking it would have cost more lives than it saved. There was a long silence. Then the analyst closed the file. "Then you made the right call." It was supposed to be reassurance, but it landed like a verdict, final, cold, impersonal. The kind of judgment made from safe offices far away from rain-soaked windows and trembling hands. That night she found herself drawn back to the sniper range. The air was sharp and cold, the moonlight thin and silver against the steel targets. She lined up shot after shot, each one a heartbeat, each impact a question. Why did she still feel like she'd done something wrong? The truth she had begun to understand was this: the moral weight of war wasn't about who deserved to die. It was about who was left to remember. And Nova remembered everything. A week later, Team 7 was called in for another op, this time a hostage rescue on the outskirts of a ruined industrial city. The enemy was different, but the stakes were the same. Civilians in danger, a fortified compound in too little time. From her perch atop a crumbling concrete silo, Nova scanned the target site. Hostiles moved in predictable patrols. The hostages, at least 6, were being held in a reinforced structure near the center. 7 actual, this is Ghost, she whispered. Visual on hostages, 2 armed inside, 1 on rooftop overwatch. Recommend silent breach from south. Copy Ghost, Vance replied. We're moving. The plan unfolded smoothly until it didn't. Halfway through the breach, one of the rooftop sentries moved in a way she hadn't anticipated. He stopped by a window and peered inside, into the same room where the hostages were being held. One wrong move now, and he could sound the alarm before Team 7 even reached the door. Her crosshairs hovered over his chest. The shot was clean. The math was perfect, but something inside her hesitated. This wasn't the HVT. This wasn't a man orchestrating attacks. This was a low-level guard who likely didn't even understand what he was part of. He was younger than she was, maybe 22, 23. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Ghost status, Vance hissed over comms. She didn't respond immediately. 2 seconds passed. 3. The shot remained lined up, but her finger didn't move. Then the guard turned away from the hostages, back toward his patrol route. She exhaled slowly and lowered her rifle. Target disengaged, she whispered. Proceed. The rest of the op went by the book. Team 7 breached, neutralized the threats, and pulled the hostages out without a single shot fired on Overwatch. But Nova couldn't shake the tremor in her hands as she packed up her rifle. It wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was doubt. Later in the debrief room, Vance studied her quietly. You had a shot on that rooftop, he said. I did. But you didn't take it. She met his gaze. I didn't have to. There was a long silence, then he nodded. And that's why you're the best, you know the difference. But as she walked out of the room, Nova wasn't sure she agreed. The line between restraint and hesitation had started to blur. The weight of that family, that frozen moment behind glass, still lived in her chest. And now it was shaping the way she saw every target, every trigger, every choice. Maybe that was growth. Maybe it was danger she didn't know yet. But she did know this. War had stopped being about right and wrong a long time ago. Now, it was about the spaces in between, the moments when silence mattered more than the shot. And somewhere deep down, she wondered if that was the real lesson the forest had been trying to teach her all along. The mission came without warning, a flash tasking pushed to the top of priority channels. A joint NATO convoy carrying encrypted intel had been ambushed outside a desert village near the northern frontier. Survivors were pinned in a collapsed structure. Hostile reinforcements were inbound. QRF was hours away. Extraction window is 30 minutes, the ops officer said, voice clipped and tense. If they overrun that position, they'll have the codes to 3 active operations. SEAL Team 7 was already prepping before the briefing ended. Body armor snapped, rifles locked into mounts, helicopters spun up under the morning sun, and as always, Nova was assigned Overwatch. Only this time, something felt different. Ghost, Vance said quietly as they loaded up, I need you sharp today. No hesitation. If you see a threat, you neutralize it. Understood? She met his eyes and nodded. Understood. But deep down, she wasn't sure. The Black Hawk skimmed low over the barren landscape, sand whipping against the fuselage. Below, the village came into view, a cluster of clay buildings clinging to the edge of a dried-up riverbed. Black smoke curled into the sky. Gunfire echoed faint and steady, like a heartbeat refusing to die. 30 hostiles confirmed, Vance said into the comms. Reinforcements en route, Ghost eyes on. Copy, she whispered, already sliding into position on a crumbling rooftop 2 clicks north. Her rifle settled against her shoulder. Through the scope, The battlefield unfolded, the collapsed structure where 4 NATO operators were trapped, the burning wreckage of their convoy, the advancing enemy squads fanning out through narrow alleys. It was a textbook kill zone, and they were already losing. 7 actual, this is Ghost, she radioed. Multiple hostiles advancing from north and west. Recommend staggered approach on exfil. Copy, Vance replied. We're moving. The first shot came easy, a machine gunner setting up behind a burned-out truck. Wind 5 mph cross, distance 480 meters. Exhale, squeeze, down. The second 2, a squad leader signaling a flanking move. 2 inches of holdover. Drop. But then, at 520 meters, something she hadn't expected. A teenage boy, 16 maybe, sprinting toward the structure with a rifle slung awkwardly over his shoulder. He wasn't uniformed. He wasn't coordinated. He was clumsy, terrified, reckless. And her crosshairs were on his chest. Ghost, do you have a shot? Vance barked. She did, but her finger wouldn't move. It wasn't the hesitation of calculation. It was the hesitation of conscience. Was he even part of the ambush? Was he a fighter or just a terrified local who had picked up a weapon? 3 seconds passed, then 4. The boy ducked into an alley and disappeared from view. Ghost report. Lost visual, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Damn it, Vance hissed. We can't afford that. She didn't respond. Her pulse was hammering now. Hesitation had cost them an easy neutralization, and it wasn't over. The firefight intensified. Hostiles pushed closer. Mortars thundered against the collapsed building. Dust and debris filled the air. Team 7 fought their way forward, each meter earned in blood and grit. Contact North Alley, Brick shouted. Nova swung her scope and her stomach dropped. The boy was back. And this time he wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding a satchel charge, sprinting straight toward the trapped operators. Oh God! She adjusted, wind 2, elevation +1. Ghost, take the shot, Vance roared. This time there was no hesitation. The shot broke clean. The boy fell mid-stride, the satchel tumbling harmlessly into the dirt. A breathless silence followed. Then the comms erupted. Explosive threat neutralized. Repeat, neutralized. But there was no relief, none at all. Because she knew, if she'd taken the shot 4 minutes earlier, he never would have made it that far. And maybe, just maybe, the boy wouldn't be lying there now, motionless in the sand. The team breached the structure, extracting the survivors under a hail of gunfire. Nova's rifle carved open lanes, dropped flankers, shattered momentum. By the time the last man was loaded into the evac Humvee, 50 minutes had passed. The mission was a success. The intel was safe. No operators were lost. And yet, when the Blackhawk lifted them away from the battlefield, no one spoke. Vance sat across from her, helmet in his lap, eyes searching her face. What happened? He asked quietly. Nova didn't answer right away. She stared down at her hands, the hands that had hesitated, the hands that had pulled the trigger too late. I saw him, she said finally, but I didn't shoot. Why? Because he looked like a kid. Vance sighed, not angry, not disappointed, just tired. He was, and he was also about to kill 4 of ours. That's the reality, Ghost. You don't get to decide who's old enough to pull a trigger. You only decide if they live long enough to do it. She swallowed hard. I know. Do you? His gaze sharpened. Because next time that hesitation might not cost a second chance. The words stung, because they were true. That night Nova walked the perimeter alone. The desert air was cool against her skin, the stars distant and uncaring. Somewhere beyond the wire, families were mourning the boy she had killed. Somewhere closer, 4 operators were alive because of it. She tried to weigh one against the other and found she couldn't. This was the paradox no one prepared you for, that both things could be true, that she could be a savior and a monster in the same breath, That victory and regret could live side by side in her chest. And in that moment, she understood something deeper than tactics or training. War wasn't about good and evil. It wasn't even about right and wrong. It was about choices, impossible, brutal, necessary choices, and the scars they carved into the people who made them. She closed her eyes and exhaled. The boy's face would stay with her. They all did. And maybe that was the price of doing this job right, not forgetting, not forgiving herself, not letting the weight grow light. Because lightness meant she'd stopped caring. And the day she stopped caring, the day the hesitation vanished completely, that would be the day she stopped being human. What happens when the mission ends, but the war refuses to leave you? For Nova, that question didn't come on a battlefield or in a debriefing room. It came one night months later when the desert winds were still and the base was quiet enough to hear her own heartbeat. The missions had kept coming, one after another, some clean, some messy, some successful in ways that didn't feel like victory. But even in the silence between them, she could still feel the recoil in her shoulder, still smell the cordite, still see the faces. They didn't fade anymore. They stayed. All of them, the insurgent commander with the family behind the glass, the teenage boy sprinting with the satchel charge, the faceless silhouettes she dropped before they could even raise a rifle. They had become part of her now, woven into the fabric of who she was. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted them to leave. The base psychologist had asked to see her, routine evaluation, they'd called it. Standard procedure after 3 high-casualty operations. Nova had almost declined. But then she'd remembered the boy's face, the hesitation that had nearly cost lives, and she realized maybe routine was exactly what she needed. The office was plain, beige walls, a pot of dying plants in the corner, a faint smell of antiseptic and coffee. The psychologist was younger than she expected, soft-spoken, with the kind of eyes that didn't judge. "Do you dream about them?" he asked. "Yes." "Do you remember their faces?" "Every one." "Do you regret it?" Nova stared out the window for a long time before answering. "I regret that it was necessary." The psychologist nodded slowly. "That's not the same as regretting the choice." "No," she said, "it is." "Do you think you'll ever stop remembering?" Nova thought of the forest in Montana, of her father's voice teaching her patience, of the ridge, the valley, the smoke, of the men who had doubted her and the ones who'd survived because of her. "I hope not," she said finally. "If I forget, it means I've stopped caring, and if I stop caring, I shouldn't be holding a rifle." Weeks later, she stood once again before a classroom, a new generation of snipers, some barely out of training, some already hardened by deployments. The lesson that day wasn't about wind drift or shot grouping. It wasn't about elevation holds or range estimation. It was about why. "People will tell you this job is about hitting targets," she said, packing slowly across the room. "They'll tell you it's about saving lives or taking them, but the truth is simpler and harder than that." She stopped and let the silence stretch. "This job is about responsibility. It's about making choices most people never have to make and then living with them. Every single day." A hand shot up in the back row. A young woman, barely 20, asked the question Nova had been waiting for. "How do you live with it?" Nova smiled faintly. "By remembering that it's not about you. It's about the people who get to go home because of what you did. It's about the teammates who see another sunrise, the civilians who make it through the night. That's the part that matters, and if you ever lose sight of that, step away, because you'll do more harm than good." The room was silent, not out of fear, out of respect. That night she walked alone to the ridge outside the base, the same way she always did before deployment. The desert stretched endless and empty before her, the stars sharp against the dark. She set her rifle down beside her and sat cross-legged in the dirt, listening. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, another mission was already waiting. Another valley, Another kill zone, another choice. She knew the ghosts would follow her there too. They always did. And maybe they always should, because each one reminded her of the cost of this life, of the thin line she walked between necessity and regret, between violence and salvation. She traced the edge of the patch Brick had given her, Team 7 Guardian, and felt the weight of it settle deeper into her chest. She wasn't just a sniper anymore. She was a teacher, a protector, a custodian of lessons paid for in blood. Her comms buzzed a new tasking order: extraction op, remote region, unknown resistance. She exhaled once slowly. Then she picked up the rifle, brushed the dust from its stock, and stood. This was who she was. Not because she loved the fight, she didn't. Not because she wanted to prove herself, she no longer needed to. But because there were people out there who would never know her name, who would never see her face, and who would live because she was willing to do what they could not. The war would never leave her, but neither would the reason she fought it. She looked up at the stars, cold, indifferent, eternal, and felt something shift inside her. Not peace, not forgiveness, something smaller, quieter, but stronger. Acceptance. Because some wars don't end with the last shot fired. Some wars live on inside the people who fought them. And maybe that's not a curse. Maybe that's the price of doing something that matters. And in the end, as she walked back toward the base and into the next mission, Nova Ghost, Martinez carried with her a truth as steady and certain as the rifle on her back. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And sometimes the quietest trigger pull can echo for a lifetime. The end.